Carl Jung explained letting go isn't the end, it's the beginning of your sacred self. What if I told you that letting someone go is not the end of love, but the beginning of a sacred journey into your own soul? That behind the heartbreak, the emptiness, the chaos, lies a spiritual transformation so powerful that Carl Jung called it a descent into your personal underworld. And what if the pain you feel right now is the very fire that will forge the strongest, most authentic version of yourself? In this video, we will journey deep into the forbidden corners of your psyche beyond heartbreak, beyond the ego, into the alchemical process of death and rebirth that begins the moment you finally decide to let them go. Part 1, the psychological and spiritual shock of letting go. Carl Jung analysis. Letting go of someone we once held dear is never just an external event. It is a profound inner rupture that shakes the very foundation of our psychological structure. From Carl Jung's depth psychology perspective, the decision to release someone from our lives is not only an emotional upheaval, but a spiritual earthquake that disrupts the balance between the persona, the ego, and the deeper layers of the psyche. This act triggers an existential and spiritual crisis, one that most people try to avoid at all costs because it forces them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, their attachments, and the illusions they have clung to. Jung would assert that when we let someone go, what we are truly letting go of is not the person themselves, but the version of ourselves that was deeply intertwined with them. Our psychological projections, fantasies, and unmet childhood needs were all attached to that person. Letting go of them means stripping away a part of our constructed identity, the persona that was dependent on their presence. This leads to a phenomenon Jung describes as the rupture of the persona, an internal cracking of the mask we presented to the world, forcing us to confront the raw, vulnerable aspects of the self that lie beneath. This rupture is often accompanied by profound psychological symptoms: panic, disorientation, sadness, even existential despair. Jung emphasized that this is not a sign of weakness, but rather the psyche's natural reaction when its accustomed patterns are dismantled. It is the collapse of an old narrative that the ego held onto for dear life. And with its collapse, we feel as though the ground beneath our feet is giving way. In this moment, we encounter psychic chaos, a liminal state that Jung saw as both dangerous and full of potential. Spiritually, this moment marks what mystics and Jungian psychologists refer to as the dark night of the soul. It is a descent into the psychological underworld, a place where the ego no longer controls the narrative, and the unconscious rises in overwhelming force. During this phase, individuals may experience feelings of meaninglessness, identity loss, and an acute fear of isolation. These feelings are not simply psychological, but spiritual, as the soul grieves not only the loss of the other, but the crumbling of false structures that once kept it contained. Jung would argue that this collapse is an invitation, a summons from the self, the archetype of wholeness within us. The spiritual shock of letting go is a signal that our psyche is entering a phase of transformation. However, the first step is always destruction of illusions, attachments, dependencies, and false identifications. This stage is marked by confusion, inner fragmentation, and emotional vulnerability. The ego, previously inflated and secure, and is now forced into a state of surrender. It is during this psychological death that many feel tempted to run backward, to grasp at the familiar, to cling to the past, or to distract themselves with new attachments. Jung would caution against this regression, calling it a betrayal of the individuation process, the inner journey toward authentic selfhood. To escape the pain prematurely is to abort the spiritual process that seeks to birth a more integrated, conscious being. Jung's writings on the symbolic function of suffering are particularly relevant here. He suggests that suffering is the psyche's way of initiating transformation by dismantling outdated structures. The suffering one experiences when letting someone go is not merely emotional pain, it is the dismantling of inner architectures that no longer serve the soul's growth. From a spiritual lens, this is the cracking of the psychological shell, the necessary condition for rebirth and renewal. Moreover, Jung highlighted the importance of conscious suffering, which means facing the pain intentionally, reflecting on its meaning, and allowing it to work upon the psyche without resistance. This is in stark contrast to unconscious suffering, which leads to repression, neurosis, and compulsive behaviors aimed at avoiding the inner void. Conscious suffering, though excruciating, is the gateway to spiritual maturation, as it strips away what is false and makes room for the emergence of a deeper truth. From the spiritual shock of letting go emerges the first glimmer of spiritual humility. Jung believed that true humility comes not from social virtue, but from the soul's confrontation with its own insignificance in the face of the greater forces of the unconscious and the self. Letting someone go forces us to accept that we cannot control others, that love does not guarantee possession, and that the soul's journey is ultimately a solitary one. This realization is both devastating and liberating. It dissolves the ego's illusions of omnipotence and makes space for a more honest relationship with the self and the world. In essence, Jung would describe the psychological and spiritual shock of letting go as the first death in the alchemical process of transformation. It is the moment when the blackness of Negredo descends upon the soul, signaling the end of a phase and the painful preparation for something new. It is not the end, it is the necessary prelude to the sacred work of inner renewal that will unfold in the later stages of the individuation journey. But in this first phase, the only task is to endure, to stay present with the pain, to witness the collapse without interference, and to trust that from this psychic devastation, the seeds of a more authentic self are being quietly planted in the depths of the soul. Part 2, Encountering the Shadow. Facing the dark unconscious when you let go. Carl Jung analysis. When you decide to let someone go, you are not only releasing them from your outer life, you are also initiating a confrontation with the most suppressed, hidden, and rejected parts of your psyche. For Carl Jung, this confrontation is unavoidable because the act of detachment strips away distractions and excuses, forcing you to face your own shadow. The shadow in Jung's theory is the unconscious repository of everything we deny, fear, suppress, or fail to integrate into our conscious personality. It contains both our repressed wounds and our denied potentials. Jung believed that in every relationship, particularly intense emotional or romantic ones, we project aspects of our shadow onto the other. That person becomes a screen for our unlived desires, our unresolved childhood needs, and even the traits we most despise but secretly embody. Therefore, letting go of someone triggers the collapse of these projections, forcing us to confront what has always been ours, but what we have long pretended belonged to the other. This is why letting someone go feels so devastating, not simply because they leave, but because we are suddenly face to face with parts of ourselves we have been avoiding. Jung observed that when the shadow erupts into consciousness, it is experienced as darkness, chaos, and intense emotional upheaval. Individuals may experience rage, grief, jealousy, regret, self-loathing, or a deep sense of abandonment. From a Jungian lens, these emotions are not irrational, they are the cries of the shadow, demanding to be seen and integrated. For many, this phase is the most terrifying. When the distraction of the relationship is removed, the ego is left alone with its unprocessed fears, insecurities, and wounds. These may manifest as obsessive thoughts about the person, fantasies of revenge, overwhelming guilt, or an existential sense of failure. Jung would interpret these symptoms as the ego's desperate attempt to reassert control over the unleashed chaos of the shadow. Spiritually, this confrontation is a descent into the personal underworld. It is a modern psychological parallel to ancient mythologies where the hero descends into Hades, the abyss, or the dark forest, not to be destroyed, but to reclaim lost parts of the soul. Jung saw this as an essential part of the individuation process. But he also warned that many people fail at this stage. They become stuck in bitterness, cynicism, or depression because they resist seeing the shadow as their own. They continue blaming the other person, thereby projecting the shadow outward and missing the sacred opportunity to retrieve their inner gold. Jung emphasized the practice of shadow work, which involves deliberately turning toward these dark feelings, exploring them with curiosity rather than judgment, and taking ownership of them. This does not mean condoning harmful behavior from others. Rather, it means using the rupture as a mirror for self-reflection. What did this person awaken in me? What did I project onto them? What part of me did they activate that I now need to reclaim for myself? This phase requires brutal honesty. It demands that you admit uncomfortable truths about your patterns, your needs for validation, your fear of loneliness, your avoidance of responsibility for your own happiness. Jung called this moral courage, the willingness to confront the parts of yourself that the ego would rather keep hidden. Spiritually, Jung saw the integration of the shadow as the first major gateway to wholeness. Until the shadow is faced and embraced, any attempt to move on will be superficial, and the same patterns will resurface in future relationships. In his words, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the heart of the spiritual work, triggered by letting go, transforming the darkness, not by fighting it, but by illuminating it. In practical terms, this phase might involve intense periods of solitude, journaling, therapy, or deep inner reflection. Dreams become especially important during this time, as the unconscious uses symbolic imagery to reveal what the conscious mind cannot yet face directly. Jung encouraged paying attention to dreams during shadow confrontations, as they often contain archetypal images that guide the soul through the darkness. Importantly, Jung warned against two dangers in this phase. First, the inflation of the ego, where the person falsely believes they have conquered their pain while secretly repressing the shadow even deeper. Second, complete identification with the shadow, which can lead to despair, nihilism, or destructive behaviors. The path Jung advocated was one of conscious balance, neither repressing nor becoming the shadow, but integrating it into a larger, more authentic sense of self. This is where the spiritual dimension of the work becomes clear. Letting someone go is not just an act of detachment, it is a sacred descent into the realm of the soul's forgotten wounds and gifts. It is an invitation to retrieve the exiled parts of yourself that you had once given away to another person. It is the beginning of a deeper relationship, not with the person you released, but with your own psyche, your own soul, and ultimately, with the self, the totality of your being. This phase is messy, painful, and unpredictable. Jung would insist that no one can bypass it without spiritual consequences. To avoid it is to remain trapped in cycles of projection, addiction, and disempowerment. To embrace it is to step onto the true path of individuation, where you begin to reclaim the authority to define yourself not through relationships, but through the conscious dialogue with your inner world. In the next phase, Jung's alchemical symbolism will illuminate how this confrontation with the shadow sets the stage for the ego death and the deeper transformative processes that follow. Part 3. Ego death, the dissolution of the old self in the process of letting go. Carl Jung analysis. In Jungian depth psychology, the moment you let go of someone important is not merely a social separation. It marks the initiation of what Jung called the death of the ego, or more precisely, the death of the old self. This death is not metaphorical, psychologically and spiritually. The structures of identity you once built around this relationship begin to disintegrate. The ego, the part of the psyche that creates the illusion of a stable, coherent identity, finds itself dismantled by forces from the unconscious, leaving you disoriented, stripped, and exposed to the rawness of existence itself. Carl Jung emphasized that this ego death is unavoidable if one is to undergo genuine transformation. Many people misunderstand the process of letting go as simply replacing one attachment with another, moving on with their lives without acknowledging that their entire sense of self was intertwined with the person they're releasing. In Jungian terms, this bypassing is a form of repression, which only prolongs the inevitable reckoning with the self. When you decide to let someone go, particularly after an emotionally enmeshed relationship, your psyche undergoes an internal collapse of the persona and its protective structures. You are no longer able to hide behind the roles you played: lover, partner, savior, victim, or caretaker. These roles provided the ego with an identity scaffold. Without them, you are plunged into what Jung described as the void of psychic death, a space where all previous certainties evaporate. In this death state, you might feel as though you are unraveling, losing grip on who you are, what your life means, or where you belong. This is not pathology. Jung saw it as a sacred dismantling. The ego, having been over-identified with external attachments, is being forced into humility, into recognizing its smallness in the face of the greater self, the wholeness that resides beyond the ego's narrow vision. Jungian alchemy uses the stage of Nigredo to symbolize this dark night of the soul. Nigredo represents decomposition, decay, the breaking down of the old so that something new can emerge from the ashes. In psychological terms, Nigredo is the phase where you feel lost, hopeless, and fragmented. But this very breakdown is the fertile soil in which transformation is possible. From a spiritual standpoint, the death of the ego is necessary because it clears the space for the emergence of the sacred self, the deeper dimension of being that cannot be accessed while the ego remains inflated and in control. Jung asserted that as long as the ego clings to its familiar roles, projections, and narratives, the individual remains trapped in a shallow, incomplete experience of life. The death of the old self, therefore, is an invitation into a deeper, more authentic alignment with the self, which represents both the personal and transpersonal aspects of the psyche. Many people fear this phase intensely. It feels like annihilation. The truth, according to Jung, is that it is annihilation, but only of the parts of you that were never real to begin with. What dies is the false self, the mask, the illusions of control, the compulsive needs for validation from others. What survives is what is eternal, authentic, and indivisible within you. This phase is marked by existential questions that pierce into the core of your being. Who am I without this person? What remains of me when I am no longer needed, desired, or defined by another? What is the purpose of my pain, my emptiness, my longing? These are not questions the ego can answer. They are invitations from the self, calling you into a new relationship with your inner world, with mystery, and with the unknown. Jung described this process as the sacrifice of the ego upon the altar of the self, where the old forms must be surrendered so that the new can emerge, not from willpower, but from a deeper source of wisdom within the psyche. Spiritually, this death phase is an opportunity to practice radical surrender. It is an act of faith not in religious dogma, but in the archetypal process of death and rebirth that governs all psychological and spiritual growth. The ego cannot control this process. It can only endure it, witness it, and allow the unconscious to do its sacred work. During this period, many may experience dreams of death, funerals, decaying bodies, or collapsing buildings. Jung interpreted these as symbols of the inner ego death, the psyche's way of processing the dissolution of old structures. Jung would encourage the individual to approach these images not with fear, but with reverence, understanding them as messages from the unconscious that transformation is underway. Jung warned that trying to resurrect the old self through distractions, rebounds, addictions, or superficial relationships only deepens the suffering. As the soul knows that what is being clung to is already dead, the only path forward is through the darkness, allowing the ego to dissolve, trusting that a more integrated, authentic self is forming in the hidden depths. This is the phase where the spiritual warrior is born not through external victories, but through the willingness to die inwardly, to face the void, to let the false self burn in the fires of transformation. Jung called this the path of individuation, the path toward wholeness that begins, paradoxically, with surrender. It is here that the mystical dimension of letting go reveals itself most starkly. You are not just losing someone. You are dying to an old identity that no longer serves your soul's evolution. And though the ego fears this death as the ultimate defeat, the soul recognizes it as the necessary threshold to liberation. In the next phase, Jung's psychology will reveal how from this death arises the awakening of individuation, where the individual begins to separate from collective patterns and step into their unique path of self-realization. Part 4, Individuation Awakening, the rebirth of the authentic self after letting go. Carl Jung analysis. After the death of the old ego and the painful process of letting go, Carl Jung believed that the psyche, now stripped of its illusions, enters a critical phase of awakening the individuation process. This is where the true spiritual and psychological journey begins. Individuation, in Jungian psychology, is the process by which an individual becomes who they truly are, beyond social masks, projections, and unconscious conditioning. It is the integration of the conscious and unconscious mind, a reconciliation between the ego and the self. Jung saw individuation not as a luxury for the spiritually inclined, but as a necessity for anyone seeking psychological wholeness. And often, it takes a profound rupture like the letting go of someone significant to activate this process. The pain acts as a spiritual catalyst, shaking the ego from its complacency and forcing it to engage with deeper layers of the psyche. In the immediate aftermath of ego death, there is a dangerous psychological vacuum. The temptation is to rush into new identities, roles, or relationships to fill the void left by the departed person. Jung warned that this compulsion is a trap that keeps the individual locked in repetitive patterns of projection and dependency. The individuation process requires that the individual endure the emptiness without filling it prematurely, allowing the authentic self to emerge from within rather than being constructed from without. At this stage, the individual begins to separate from the collective unconscious influences, the societal expectations, familial conditioning, cultural ideals that previously dictated their behavior and values. Jung argued that most people live unconsciously within the collective, believing their desires, dreams, and beliefs are personal when, in fact, they are inherited or imposed by the larger culture. Letting someone go often strips away these layers, forcing the individual to ask, what do I truly value? Independent of others? What is my authentic path? Separate from the roles I once played. Who am I now that no one is watching? This is the sacred moment of the birth of the autonomous individual. Someone no longer defined by their attachments or roles, but by their inner alignment with the self. It is not an easy process. Jung described it as walking the narrow, lonely road that few dare to tread, because it demands radical honesty, self-reflection, and the willingness to stand apart from the herd. Spiritually, this is the phase where the individual encounters their inner guide, the archetype of the wise old man, the sage, or the inner teacher. Jung believed that the self speaks to us through symbols, dreams, synchronicities, and intuitions. In the silence that follows ego death, the voice of the self becomes audible for the first time. It may come as a subtle longing, a creative impulse, a desire to explore unknown aspects of oneself. The psyche begins to reorganize itself, not according to old patterns, but according to the deeper blueprint of the self. This phase is also marked by the reclaiming of lost psychic energy in relationships, especially codependent or toxic ones. Large portions of the psyche's energy are invested in maintaining the attachment, managing anxieties, and avoiding inner wounds. Letting go frees this energy, allowing it to flow inward and be redirected toward personal growth, creativity, and spiritual exploration. Jung called this libido withdrawal and redirection, a key aspect of individuation. However, Jung warned that the individuation process is not linear. It is cyclical, involving repeated confrontations with the shadow, ego inflation, disillusionment, and integration. The initial awakening is often followed by setbacks, doubts, and even periods of regression. Jung encouraged patience and humility during these phases, recognizing them as necessary spirals of the soul's unfolding journey. Practically, the individuation phase might manifest as a withdrawal from social circles that no longer resonate, a deep dive into creative practices, solitude, or nature, a yearning for inner exploration through dreams, active imagination, or therapy, a dismantling of old belief systems and the construction of a personal philosophy. Spiritually, this phase is not about isolation, but about rebuilding your inner temple, so that future connections are made from a place of wholeness, not emptiness. Jung emphasized that individuation is not selfish. On the contrary, It is the highest act of service to the world. When individuals become whole, they cease projecting their wounds onto others and instead become vessels of authentic love, wisdom, and compassion. From the ashes of letting go, the individual rises not as a damaged, broken person, but as someone who has faced the underworld of their psyche and emerged with hard-earned wisdom. The sacred scars of their loss become symbols of their courage, reminders that they have chosen the path of consciousness over comfort. Jung believed that the hallmark of individuation is a sense of inner authority, no longer driven by external validation or approval. The individuated person moves through life guided by an internal compass rooted in their connection to the self. They no longer seek others to complete them. They seek relationships that complement their wholeness. This phase marks the beginning of a new relationship with the world, not as someone seeking to fill a void, but as someone overflowing with their own authenticity, ready to engage with life, love, and others from a space of sovereignty, responsibility, and freedom. In the next phase, Jungian psychology explores how this individuation awakening leads to the alchemical process of inner transformation, where the wounds of letting go are transmuted into spiritual gold. Part 5, the alchemical transformation, the inner alchemy of letting go. Carl Jung analysis. In the aftermath of the ego's death in the initial awakening of individuation, Carl Jung described the next phase as an alchemical transformation, a psychological and spiritual process in which the raw material of your suffering, grief, and shadow is transmuted into inner gold. This is not merely a metaphor. For Jung, alchemy was the symbolic language of the psyche's deepest transformations. He saw ancient alchemy as a spiritual discipline disguised in chemical language, mirroring the soul's journey from chaos to order, from darkness to illumination. Letting go of someone then becomes the starting point for this inner alchemical work, a sacred process of burning away illusions, purifying wounds, and distilling the essence of the self from the debris of the past. Jung identified several key stages in this process, each corresponding to distinct psychological experiences that unfold after the initial rupture. The first stage is nigredo, or blackening, which you already entered when the ego collapsed. This is the state of psychic darkness, confusion, and despair in letting go. This is the phase where you feel lost, empty, and consumed by grief, anger, or regret. But crucially, Jung saw nigredo as a fertile darkness and necessary chaos from which transformation begins. This is the womb of the soul, where the old self decomposes to nourish the emergence of something new. After enduring the darkness of nigredo, the psyche enters albedo, awaken, or whitening. This is the stage where the first glimmers of clarity begin to appear. In the context of letting go, this might manifest as insights into the relationship's deeper lessons, moments of self-compassion, or an emerging sense of inner peace amidst the pain. Jung believed that albedo is the phase of purification, where you begin to separate your projections from the truth, discern your authentic feelings from conditioned reactions, and wash away the residues of resentment, blame, or attachment that clouded your inner vision. Spiritually, albedo is the first taste of freedom, not freedom from pain, but freedom from identification with the pain. You begin to see that the person you let go of was not the source of your wholeness, but a mirror reflecting both your light and your darkness. This is the stage where you reclaim your projections, acknowledging that what you sought in them was already within you, waiting to be integrated. Following albedo is citrinitas, or yellowing, a stage of awakening inner wisdom and creative energy. Jung saw this as the phase where the ego, now humbled and purified, begins to align with the deeper self. This is when individuals often feel a surge of creativity, a desire to explore new paths, and an intuitive sense that their pain was not meaningless but part of a larger unfolding. The psychic gold begins to reveal itself hidden talents, forgotten dreams, or newfound spiritual insights that had been buried under the weight of the old self. Letting go of someone, from this perspective, becomes not a loss but a crucible of transformation, in which the raw lead of your suffering is transmuted into the gold of wisdom, strength, and authenticity. Jung emphasized that this is not a passive process. It requires active engagement with the unconscious through dream work, active imagination, art, journaling, or rituals that honor the inner work. Finally, the culmination of the alchemical process is rubedo, or reddening, the stage of integration and embodiment. This is when the new self, forged in the fires of pain and purified by the waters of self-reflection, begins to radiate outward. You no longer carry your wounds as burdens, but as sacred marks of your journey. You move through the world not as someone seeking to be completed, but as someone overflowing with their own fullness. At this stage, letting go becomes an act of generativity, not merely detachment. You recognize that in releasing the other. You have made space for something far more expansive, the deep, embodied relationship with your own soul. You begin to engage with life not from a place of lack, but from abundance, offering your presence, wisdom, and love freely. Without the hooks of codependency or projection, Jung would insist that this inner alchemy is not linear nor final. It is a cyclical process, one that repeats at deeper levels throughout life. Each time we let go of people, identities, beliefs, we are invited back into the alchemical vessel, where the next layer of the self is purified, integrated, and reborn. Spiritually, this is the stage where the individual embodies what Jung called the philosopher's stone within a state of wholeness where opposites are reconciled, where the wounds of the past become portals to the sacred, and where love, once bound by attachment and fear, is liberated into its highest form, unconditional, autonomous, and generative. Letting go, then, is revealed not as an end, but as the initiation into the great work of inner alchemy, where loss becomes the doorway to the sacred, suffering becomes the forge of wisdom, and the death of the old self makes way for the radiant emergence of the individuated, spiritually awakened being. In the next phase, Jung's teachings illuminate how this transformation empowers the individual to reclaim their inner authority, no longer driven by projections onto others, but standing firmly in the sovereignty of their own being. Part 6, Reclaiming Inner Authority. The Sacred Return of Personal Power After Letting Go. Carl Jung Analysis. Once the alchemical process of inner transformation has been initiated, Carl Jung emphasized that the next profound phase is the reclamation of inner authority. This is where the individual, having endured the death of the old self, the confrontation with the shadow, and the purification of psychic wounds, begins to reclaim the power they once unconsciously handed over to others. In the context of letting go of someone, Jung believed that much of the suffering stems not just from the loss of the person, but from the energetic and psychological authority we ceded to them during the relationship, whether it was our sense of worth, purpose, or emotional safety. We allowed significant parts of our identity and power to be defined, validated, or controlled by the other. In Jungian terms, this is a form of ego inflation through projection, where the ego projects its unlived potential, its authority, or its spiritual center onto the other, thereby diminishing itself. When the relationship ends and the painful dissolution takes place, the individual is confronted with a psychic emptiness where those projections once lived. This creates a vacuum, and Jung warned that unless consciously reclaimed, this vacuum will attract new people, addictions, or compulsive patterns that perpetuate the same dynamic of power surrender. Reclaiming inner authority, then, is not about becoming hard, detached, or controlling. It is a spiritual act of retrieving the exiled parts of the self and integrating them back into conscious ownership. Jung saw this as the psychological equivalent of returning to the throne of your own psyche, no longer abdicating sovereignty to lovers, societal expectations, or unconscious archetypes. This reclamation requires several key steps. First, the individual must recognize where they gave their power away. Jung encouraged brutal self-honesty here. Where did I make them responsible for my happiness? Where did I suppress my truth to keep the relationship intact? Where did I seek permission to exist, to feel, to create from someone outside of me? These questions open the door to shadow integration as they reveal the parts of us that felt unworthy, powerless, or fearful of standing alone. Jung believed that when you reclaim inner authority, you must be willing to stand in the face of these fears without flinching. It is an act of psychic self-responsibility. Second, the individual must withdraw their projections from the external world and reinvest that energy into the self. This means seeing the qualities you admired or resented in the other as aspects of yourself that you must now own, develop, or integrate. For example, if you idealize their strength, ask where your own strength lies dormant. If you blame them for your emotional turmoil, ask what inner patterns allowed you to remain in that dynamic. Jung insisted that this is where true empowerment begins, not by changing the outer world, but by transforming the inner landscape. Third, the individual must begin to act from this reclaimed center of authority. Jung emphasized that inner authority is not simply an internal state. It must be expressed in the outer world through conscious choices, boundaries, and actions that honor your authentic self. This might mean saying no to relationships, jobs, or social circles that no longer align with your truth. It might mean pursuing creative or spiritual callings that you once abandoned out of fear or self-doubt. Spiritually, this is the phase where the individual recognizes that the only true authority is the self within, not the ego, but the archetypal self that holds the blueprint for your unique journey of individuation. Jung wrote extensively about how the self, once obscured by projections onto others, becomes the guiding force of your life when you reclaim your inner authority. At this stage, individuals often experience a profound shift in how they relate to others. Relationships are no longer formed from neediness, dependency, or projection. They emerge from wholeness, clarity, and autonomy. The individuated person no longer seeks others to complete them, but to complement them. This shift transforms not only personal relationships, but the entire orientation toward life itself. You become less reactive, less grasping, less entangled in the dramas of the outer world, because you are rooted in your inner sovereignty. Jung saw this stage as a psychological and spiritual homecoming. You return to yourself, not the self of the ego, but the deeper, integrated self that can now guide your life from within. This is not arrogance or isolation. It is humble empowerment, where you recognize your place in the cosmos, your relationship to the collective, and your responsibility to live authentically, even when it challenges social norms or disrupts old patterns. This reclaimed inner authority also brings a renewed sense of freedom, not the freedom of escaping pain, but the freedom of embracing your path, your wounds, your desires, and your purpose without apology or dilution. It is the freedom of knowing that no one outside of you holds the keys to your wholeness. Jung warned that this phase is delicate. The ego, having experienced its death and rebirth, may be tempted to inflate itself again, mistaking inner authority for superiority. True authority, however, is marked by humility, compassion, and a quiet strength that requires no validation from others. In the spiritual dimension, reclaiming your authority means becoming a conscious co-creator with the self, collaborating with the deeper forces of your psyche in the universe. Rather than being a passive victim of circumstances or unconscious patterns, this is the psychological equivalent of stepping into the kingdom of your soul, where you are both servant and sovereign, answerable not to others, but to the inner truth that now speaks through you with clarity and integrity. In the next phase, Jung's framework will show how this reclaimed authority opens the way for the awakening of the sacred self, where the individual begins to experience life through the lens of spiritual wholeness and sacred connectedness. Part 7, Awakening the Sacred Self, the Spiritual Rebirth. After letting go, Carl Jung analysis. Following the reclamation of inner authority, the individual is prepared to enter one of the most transformative phases in Carl Jung's model of psychic and spiritual evolution, the awakening of the sacred self. This is where the process of letting go transcends personal healing and becomes an opening into a deeper, transpersonal dimension of the psyche, what Jung referred to as the self with a capital S, the archetype of totality, unity, and the divine center within. Throughout the early phases, ego death, shadow confrontation, inner alchemy, and the reclaiming of personal power, the individual has been progressively shedding false identities, projections, and illusions. Now, stripped bare of external definitions and inflated self-concepts, the psyche is ready to encounter the sacred core that was always there but obscured by the clutter of the ego's attachments. Jung described the self as the organizing principle of the entire psyche, the source of both personal wholeness and spiritual connection. When you let someone go and walk through the fires of inner transformation, you create the psychic conditions necessary for the self to emerge from the unconscious into conscious awareness. This is not a mental idea, but a felt experience, often accompanied by dreams, synchronicities, or numinous moments where you sense a presence within you that is larger, wiser, and more encompassing than the ego. Spiritually, this is the phase where letting go reveals its ultimate purpose, not merely to detach from a person, but to reconnect to your own soul's sacred essence, to the deeper wisdom that can only be heard in the silence that follows loss. Jung believed that the suffering of letting go was a sacred passage designed to strip the individual of false gods, those people, roles, or beliefs they worshipped externally so they could encounter the true center of divinity within themselves. The awakening of the sacred self is often experienced as a profound inner peace that does not depend on external circumstances, a sense of being connected to something greater than oneself, a subtle but unshakable trust in the unfolding of life, even amidst uncertainty, an inner voice or guidance system that feels both intimate and universal. Jung emphasized that this awakening is not a peak state to be clung to or idealized, but an ongoing relationship with the self that must be cultivated with humility and devotion. The self is not the ego's possession. It is the source from which the ego draws its vitality, purpose, and alignment. Importantly, the sacred self is not a dissociated spiritual state that floats above the human experience. Jung taught that the awakening of the self leads to greater embodiment, greater participation in life, and greater engagement with the world, but from a place of inner wholeness rather than fragmentation. The individuated person, now anchored in the self, brings their presence into relationships, work, creativity, and service, not as a way to fill a void, but as an overflow of their integrated being. Letting go from this sacred perspective becomes a doorway to transpersonal love, a form of love that is no longer bound by possession, dependency, or projection. You begin to experience love as a state of being, a force that flows through you, rather than something you must extract from others. This is the love that Jung associated with the self, unconditional, autonomous, and capable of embracing both the beauty and the pain of life without clinging or rejection. Jung would describe this as the reconciliation of opposites within the psyche, the conscious and the unconscious, the masculine and the feminine, the personal and the collective. The sacred and the mundane all find their place within the wholeness of the self. The individual no longer fears their shadow or rejects their wounds. They embrace them as essential aspects of their humanity, integrated within the larger tapestry of their soul. Spiritually, this is where the journey of letting go fulfills its highest purpose. It becomes an initiation into sacred adulthood, where you no longer seek to be saved, completed, or validated by others because you have found the eternal source of love, wisdom, and belonging within yourself. You become, in Jung's words, a vessel for the unfolding of the self into the world, a unique expression of the divine pattern that seeks to manifest through you. This awakening is often accompanied by a radical shift in life orientation. You begin to live from the inside out, guided by the subtle movements of your inner world. Rather than by the noisy demands of the outer world, decisions become less about what will make you happy or successful in the ego's terms, and more about what aligns with the integrity of your soul's journey. You become less reactive, less grasping, more receptive, and more aligned with the rhythms of life itself. Jung warned that the ego will always be tempted to co-opt this awakening, to inflate itself with spiritual pride, or to cling to the sacred experiences as a new form of identity. True awakening requires ongoing humility, a constant return to the inner center, and the recognition that the self is not an endpoint, but a living, evolving relationship that deepens over time. Letting go of someone, then, becomes not a story of loss, but a sacred rite of passage into the mystical heart of your own being, where you discover that everything you sought outside love, wholeness, safety, guidance has been within you all along, waiting patiently for the ego to make space for it. In the next phase, Jung's depth psychology will reveal how this awakened state allows you to fully integrate all parts of your psyche into a new cycle of wholeness, where the inner and outer worlds are harmonized and you step into life with a renewed sense of sacred presence. Part 8, Integration and the New Cycle of Wholeness. Harmonizing the psyche after letting go. Carl Jung analysis. At the culmination of the process of letting go, after the ego has been dismantled, the shadow integrated, inner authority reclaimed, and the sacred self awakened, the individual enters what Carl Jung regarded as the phase of integration and the new cycle of wholeness. This is not a return to the old self or a reversion to ordinary life as it was before. Rather, it is the birth of a new way of being, one where the psyche operates from a place of harmony, inner coherence, and conscious participation in both the personal and transpersonal dimensions of life. For Jung, integration is not about perfection or finality. It is the ongoing, dynamic work of ensuring that all aspects of the self, light and dark, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, are brought into relationship with each other, rather than split off, denied, or projected onto others. It is a continuous dialogue between the ego and the self, where the ego learns to take its rightful place as the servant of the self, rather than its ruler. In the context of letting go, this phase means that the individual no longer views the relationship as a source of pain, bitterness, or longing, but as an essential chapter in their individuation journey. The person they let go of is no longer seen as a villain, a savior, or an irreplaceable loss, but as a mirror who reflected back to them their own wounds, projections, and sacred potential. The story is no longer personal, it becomes mythological, part of the larger archetypal journey of death, rebirth, and transformation that the psyche is eternally undergoing. This stage is marked by several key psychological and spiritual experiences. Inner peace with the past, the individual no longer needs to rewrite or cling to the narrative of the relationship. There is acceptance, forgiveness, and a release of the need to assign blame or justify the pain. Emotional neutrality, encounters with reminders of the person, past memories, or even future interactions no longer trigger emotional upheaval. The psychic charge has been integrated. Renewed engagement with life, freed from the energetic entanglements of the past. The individual steps into new experiences, relationships, and creative expressions from a space of inner fullness, not from lack. Sacred responsibility. The individuated person understands that their well-being, growth, and happiness are their own responsibility, no longer projected onto others or dependent on external conditions. Jung described this phase as the return to the world with new eyes. The individual, having descended into the underworld of their psyche and faced their deepest wounds, now brings the gifts of their transformation back to the collective. They become, in mythological terms, the wounded healer, the wise one, or the bridge between worlds, someone who can navigate both the inner and outer realms with authenticity and compassion. Importantly, integration is not static. Jung taught that the psyche moves in spirals, not straight lines. New challenges, losses, and encounters will continue to trigger the old patterns. But the individuated person now has the tools, the inner awareness, and the relationship with the self to navigate them consciously. Letting go, from this integrated perspective, is seen not as an isolated event, but as a sacred initiation into the lifelong work of wholeness, which requires ongoing vigilance, humility, and self-reflection. Spiritually, this phase is where the individual experiences